part 2 of resurrection. If you remember, yesterday we were exploring that resurrection is in fact an authentic Jewish belief. Often people consider resurrection or associate resurrection with being the belief of other religions, Christianity namely. But Christianity, like many things, got its belief in resurrection from the original Jewish teachings. And we saw sources and verses, for example, in the prophet Yehezkel and also in the book of Daniel, explicit references to the idea of resurrection in Torah sources. We also saw many different sources in Talmudic literature that point to the belief and speak out more detail about the Jewish belief in resurrection, how, generally speaking, how it's going to happen, to who it's going to happen, and things like this. And we also discussed how it's in fact part of our Jewish, daily Jewish belief. For example, when we say Modeh Ani, or the blessing Elokai Neshama, or when we do the Amida 3 times a day, there are references in all of those examples to the Jewish belief in resurrection. And we also saw that the Rambam enumerates 13 principles of faith. One of those 13 principles of faith is the belief in the resurrection. It's such an integral part of Jewish belief that the Rambam says that anybody who doesn't believe in one of these 13 principles, including the belief in resurrection, that's tantamount to denying Jewish belief. So therefore, first and foremost, we saw many sources in verses and in Talmudic literature and in the literature of the commentaries that resurrection is in fact an original Jewish belief. We saw some interesting questions about how, for example, we would reconcile the Jewish belief of resurrection with that of reincarnation. Meaning, since Judaism believes that a soul can be brought down into many bodies, that raises the question, which of the bodies will be resurrected? We discussed several possibilities, but the main opinion seems to be that any of the bodies that were associated with perfecting the soul will merit resurrection. We also discussed whether resurrection will take place at any particular time of what's mapped out as the 6,000 years of Jewish history. And we spoke in general how it will come after the period of the end of days, after the period of Armageddon, in the period of what we're talking about, the times of the Mashiach. And we discussed whether it would be before Mashiach or after Mashiach. From the Rambam we saw that there's a gradual process that's described whereby resurrection would seem to take place after the coming of the Mashiach. And we saw different sources, whether it's 40 years after, 70 years after, or 400 years after. But sometime after the coming of the Mashiach, there will be resurrection. We also discussed that there are sources which indicate a pre-resurrection. Remember? A pre-resurrection, where even before Mashiach, or at the time of the coming of Mashiach, sources talk about how Moses and Aaron, or even members of their generation in the wilderness, other great righteous holy people, will be resurrected early on in order either to experience the redemption as it unfolds, or in the case of Moshe and Aaron, to guide the resurrection. In Moshe's case, to give the Mashiach Torah rulings about how things should be, or in the case of Aaron, in order to guide the construction of and the running of the Beis HaMikdash. And that raised a very interesting question, whether in fact Mashiach himself could be of the resurrected earlier on, and then guide the Jewish people towards the redemption. And we saw commentaries that say that that's in fact the case. Mashiach himself could be a product of an earlier phase of resurrection, and then guide the processes as we've discussed. We also looked into the question about where resurrection will take place, only in the land of Israel or even outside of the land of Israel. And the conclusion seems to be that even people who are buried outside of Israel will be resurrected. Only the way it will take place is miraculously, tunnels will be made underground. Those bodies, or the remains of the bodies, will be transported under the ground, come out in Israel, and then the bodies will be reconstructed in the land of Israel, and only after they're constructed will a soul be breathed into them, so that people come back to life in the land of the living, which is the land of Israel. The last types of things that we want to cover, which is what we're going to discuss today, are more details about how the actual body is reconstructed, what the Jewish sources say about the way the body is reconstructed specifically during resurrection. Also, for example, whether people will be resurrected as they died, or maybe the bodies will be resurrected in some miraculous type of a way. And another interesting question we want to discuss, for example, is whether only Jews will be resurrected, or will non-Jews be resurrected? And another very interesting question is, what's going to happen to the people who are actually alive at the time of the resurrection? Are they going to live through the resurrection, or will they themselves also have to undergo resurrection in order to join, right, that community of resurrected individuals afterwards? Okay? Yeah.
Could you add one question to that, and then you could discuss later?
Sure. What would that be?
Like why God made it so that there's a lot of mystery around the Mashiach.
Okay.
Instead of making it a lot more clear.
Yeah.
Like who it would be and when and exactly where.
I mean, I can answer that first, really. I don't know if I can give the most satisfactory answer, but one thing to come in mind is that everything having to do with the Mashiach, the end of days, Armageddon, reincarnation, true, but even certainly resurrection and the like, has to do with free will. And if things were too clearly mapped out, then the answers would be very obvious, in which case it would take away from free will, thereby undermining the whole purpose for which things are supposed to happen. And therefore, I think that's probably the major reason why Mashiach is clouded in doubt, for example. You mentioned Mashiach. And the sources say that even when Mashiach comes, some people will accept and others will not. It's not going to be, at least initially, clear-cut. Why? To enable people to make that free will decisions that's needed in order to perfect themselves and bring about the perfection of the world. And therefore, even Mashiach and everything surrounding that is enshrouded in doubt. And the Rambam himself says that our sources say a lot about this. We can't know for sure until it actually happens. And that's an important qualification of what we're doing here as well. You might have noticed that most of the things that we're talking about, some say this, some say that. And I've been speaking about some say this and that. The generally accepted opinion seems to be this. But it's not something which is necessarily cut and dry and conclusive. And the reason is because, like you're saying, there's doubt about all of this stuff. Number one, it's not physical, it's metaphysical. Number two, it's not here, it's sometime in the future. And number three, it really represents the coming into fruition of the whole purpose for which we were created with free will. And therefore, if we know too much about it, we'll have too much information to make the right decisions where we really have to be challenged to make those decisions. Okay? So, let's now talk a little bit about what the sources say regarding how the actual resurrection is described as taking place physically. So there's what's referred to as the loose bone. This loose bone is a special bone in the body, which is, according to our sources, the point from which the resurrected bodies will come into being. There is a midrash in Koheles Rabbah, which says that Hadrian, who was a Roman emperor, Hadrian wanted to know, and he asked, where is this loose bone located? And he addressed this question to Rabbi Yeshua ben Hananiah. So Rabbi Yeshua ben Hananiah, what this resurrection that you Jews believe in, how does it happen? Where is the body reconstructed from? And the rabbi told him it comes from the loose bone. Okay, this loose bone. What is the loose bone? The Yerushalmi in Brochos says that the loose bone is part of the remains of the body, and it's there in the place where a person has been buried. What will happen is God will bring a special type of a dew. It's called the dew of resurrection, or in Hebrew, the tal tchiyah. This dew of resurrection will seep into the ground, intermingle with the remains of the body, starting with the remains of this loose bone, and it's going to be from that point that the body is actually going to sprout forth and be reconstituted. The question is, where is this loose bone? Where is it located? Which of the bones is the loose bone? So Prt4 Rabbah in chapter 28 says that the loose bone is in the spine. It doesn't say where, but it's one of the bones in the vertebrae. It's in the spine. It's a vertebrae in the spine. Rashi also says that it's in the spine, but this Rashi on the midrash there, Prt4 Rabbah said it's located at the bottom of the spine. I don't know what the source for Rashi saying that is, but apparently has a source. The Arizal, the master Kabbalist of more recent times, said that the loose bone is actually in the upper part of the spine. And most specifically, it's that vertebrae which is opposite to the place where you put the knot of your tefillin. So that really the spine kind of goes into the skull to a certain extent. We put the knot of the tefillin here at the base of the skull, one of the vertebrae which is equal to the base of the skull. Not one of the upper ones apparently, but the one that's opposite that knot of the tefillin. So it's almost like the loose bone is going to be at that place which corresponds to the knot of the tefillin, and that knot of the tefillin is viewed sometimes as being the point beyond which human conception can no longer conceive God. Why? Because the straps, God is described as wearing tefillin, and the straps of those tefillin reach down into the world. Those are like the straps of the tefillin reaching down. Those straps go up, they go up, and then they tie behind God's head. We know that Moshe asked God, Hareini es derechecha, show me your ways. And God said to Moses, right, Lo yirani adam v'chai, a person cannot see me and live. God said, you can't see me, but I'll show you mecharai. I'll show you what's behind me. And therefore what happened is, he told Moses to hide in the crevice of a rock. God covered him with his hand as he went by. And then after God passed, he let Moses see him, and Moses was able to see, we're told, the knot of God's tefillin. So the knot of the tefillin is associated with the point at which, when we climb those straps of God's tefillin, which reach down into the world and try and extrapolate upward towards the source of God, we can get no further than that actual knot. But behind that knot, which represents the essence of God, His mind, His soul, right? That's something which we can't understand. It's tied, it's closed. Therefore, the Arizal seems to be associating Tchias HaMeisim as that kind of tied spot, corresponding to the knot of the tefillin, and the body is going to be reconstituted from that bone. That bone, which is opposite the knot of the tefillin, is going to be the takeoff point, right? From the place that which we can currently not arrive to, but from the time of Tchias HaMeisim, the resurrection will have an opening of consciousness, which will enable us to go beyond that knot, right? That's the loose bone. That's where it's located. What are some of the qualities of the loose bone? We're told in our sources that this loose bone is indestructible. Rabbi chapter 28 talks about how Rabbi Shua ben Hananiah brought a loose bone, and he put it in water, it wouldn't dissolve. He threw it in fire, it wouldn't burn. He took an anvil and hammer and started smashing it. The hammer broke, but the bone wouldn't break. According to this, there's something very strong, sturdy, and durable about that loose bone. That would perhaps be an explanation as to why it's from that bone that the body is reconstituted, because the rest of the body will decay, but this bone remains, and therefore the body will come together from that tangible remains of the buried body. There's another source which says that this bone is in the neck, it's very hard, and it will not burn, and it will not perish. Just as we see that God created Eve from the side of Adam, which might have been a rib, a bone, so too the body, which is the continuation of a person's body in this world, the resurrection will also be reconstituted from the bone. So just as Eve came from a bone, so the resurrected body will come from the bone. The fact that the source on resurrection kind of compares the relationship of Adam and Eve, the relationship of the body in this world to the next, implies that it's like a male-female partnership here. The body, or what the body provides for the person in this world as we know it, will end up, right, having a counterpart in the spiritual realm as well. So that this body and the resurrected body are in some type of relationship, like a marriage, male and female, connecting as helpmates one to the other. The question is, why the loose bone? What's so special about this loose bone that it should be the point for resurrection? Couldn't have been any. So we alluded to before the possibility that since the loose bone is stronger, it's harder, it's more durable, that's the remain of the body from which it's reconstituted. But there are explanations given in Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism as well. And one of the explanations is brought by the Rabbi, and he says that the loose bone did not receive nourishment from the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, which means that while the rest of the body derives some nourishment from that experience, the body derives some benefit, Adam and Eve's body derives some benefit from transgression, the loose bone did not. And therefore, since that loose bone was not tainted from the transgression, and that transgression resulted in mortality, such that the loose bone is not subject to mortality, It's for that reason that the loose bone, among all others, is the one that's used for reconstituting the body during resurrection, because it's free from mortality. Another explanation, which is given by the Levush, is that the loose bone itself doesn't depend on nourishment at all, and that's the reason why it's not subject to any of the temporal influences that a person experiences here in this world, in this life. And since the loose bone doesn't really derive any temporal physical nourishment, it's that part of the body which is used in the world to come, the resurrected body, which is going to be free from the type of physical nourishment that people need. Another very interesting explanation is that given by the Kaf HaChaim. The Kaf HaChaim says that there's something special about the loose bone, which it in fact does require nourishment, but it only receives its nourishment from food that's eaten on Motzei Shabbos, Saturday night. So since the sin of Adam and Eve was on Friday, that first eve of Shabbos, the rest of the body, like we said earlier, derived benefit from the eating of the fruit of knowledge, tree of good and evil, except for the loose bone. The loose bone did not. Why? Because it only derives its sustenance from food that's eaten on Saturday night, and therefore it was not tainted by mortality. The Kaf HaChaim takes it one point further and says it's for this reason that it's very important to eat the final meal of Shabbos, Malava Malka, the fourth meal of Shabbos, specifically on Saturday night, because it's only that meal which gives nourishment to the loose bone. Connecting the idea that a person who eats Malava Malka, he will merit having the world to come. Why? Because he's nourishing this loose bone from which the body will be recreated. The commentaries also discuss, basically the Midrash brings a machlokus between Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel, how the body is actually going to be reconstituted. Given the fact that it comes from the loose bone is a bone which is in the spine. It seems like it's the upper part of the spine in the area of the neck. According to the Arizal, it's opposite the place of the tefillin. Once the body starts to congeal around that loose bone, how does it actually take place? So Beit Shammai says the formation of a person in this world is not like his formation in the world to come. In this world, the formation of the embryo starts with the skin and flesh and finishes with the sinews and the bones. So it would seem that it goes from the outward in. The outer part of the person is created first, and then the inner structure comes into being. But in the future world, the world to come, the body is going to take shape with the outer shell first, the sinews and the bones, the inner first, and then the skin and the flesh will follow. Okay? So according to this description, what's going to happen is the body is going to be reconstituted from the loose bone. The inner tissues are going to be created first, and then enveloped with the outer tissues afterwards. That might convey the idea that in this world it's the other way around. A person is first created externally, and then the internal organs are developed. That's perhaps suggesting that this world is a world which is more externally located, and people put more of an emphasis on externalities first, then only second do people start approaching content. But the world to come is not going to be that way. It's going to, the main essential part of a person is going to be the inner dimension of a person, and externals are going to be of secondary importance. That's the opinion of Beit Shammai. Beit Hillel says, no, they're the same. Just the formation in this world, so will be the formation in the future, in the future to come. In this world, formation commences with the skin and flesh, and includes with the sinews and bones, meaning it goes from the outside in. So too, the world to come is going to go from the outside in. The difference of opinion, yeah? We generally say that even though the halacha nowadays is like Hillel, in the world to come, yeah, the halacha is going to be like Beit Shammai. So it could very well be that we would accept Beit Shammai's position regarding this, that even though in this world, first things are constructed from the external and then infused with the internal, in the world to come, the body is going to be created the other way around. First internally and then developed externally. When they are resurrected, these bodies, are they going to be resurrected as the person was buried, as the person's body was when he died and was buried? Or are they going to be resurrected from the outset anew, right, with a new body? So here too we find different opinions. The Gemara in Sanhedrin 91b says, Reish Lakish contrasted two verses. He said, it's written in one verse in Yirmiyahu chapter 31, I will gather them in, referring to the redemption. Among them will be the blind and the lame, the woman with child, together with the woman in labor, meaning a woman will be experiencing labor pains. So he's describing a scenario where the redemption is going to involve people who are lame and sick and blind or suffering pain. But then he says, another verse which talks about redemption in Isaiah 35 says, then shall the lame man leap like a hart, like a deer, a steed. And the tongue of the dumb shall sing, for waters will break forth from the wilderness and streams in the desert. So it seems to be a contradiction. The second verse indicates that in the time of resurrection, people that were lame will be jumping. Yes? People who were dumb and couldn't speak will be shouting out in song. So the Gemara here notes the contrast, the contradiction, tries to make sense of it. Is the redemption going to involve people who are initially sick and lame, or people who have been cured from their sicknesses and so forth and so on? So the Gemara answers, what's going to happen is people are going to initially be resurrected with the infirmities with which they were buried, and then they will be restored back to a state of health. So if a person, for example, was buried as an amputee, initially he will be resurrected without that limb, but afterwards that limb will be miraculously restored to the person. By the way, halachically speaking, if a person, God forbid, does have to have an organ removed or a limb amputated, generally speaking, the Jewish practice is to acquire a grave, bury the organ there, and have the rest of the body buried together with it when the person dies. Yeah, so that the person's body should be buried in a way, with the greatest degree of integrity as possible. The Zohar actually says a similar thing. The Zohar in Parshas Emor says, come and see, when they will awaken from the dust, so here he's explicitly talking about resurrection, as they went in, they will rise, lame or blind. If they enter lame or blind, they will rise with the same body, so that no one would say it is another one who was revived. So that people are going to come back to life as they were when they died, and that's going to help people recognize, oh, that's so-and-so, oh, that's so-and-so. Afterwards, the Holy One, blessed be He, the Zohar says, will heal them so that they will be whole, and the world will be whole in everything. Regarding this, the verse says, on that day God shall be one, and His name will be one. And the sources explain that according to this position, where the body is resurrected initially with its infirmities, and it's going to be restored to a state of health, it's going to be restored back to the state that the person was in at the age of 20. And this is based on the idea that Adam and Eve were actually created as ripe, healthy 20-year-olds. That being viewed as the pinnacle of a person's strength. Anybody here over 20? Yeah? So you're past your prime, according to this. When people will be resurrected, they will be resurrected according to the way they were buried, and then revert back to the state that they were as 20-year-olds. That being said, if God forbid a person dies before the age of 20, they'll be resurrected as they were when they died, and then be sped up in order to be brought to the prime age of 20, where a human being is considered to be at his physical, emotional, intellectual, and spiritual prime. That being said, yeah.
Just curious, after 40 days, would a fetus be, it's stillborn or aborted or whatever, would they resurrect?
That's a very interesting question. The fetus should be buried. I mean, it's no longer an embryo, it's a fetus. It's a living organism, an organ, and it should be buried. The fetus is buried. So,
after how long?
say that again?
After how long?
40 days.
Maybe it died for 40 days, it can't be born in a Jewish sanctuary, correct?
I don't know if it can't be, but it's my. I'm not. I have to be honest. I'm not 100% certain, but it's my understanding that before that period of 40 days, the baby's not buried. It's not considered to have. It's considered to be alive, but not a living being.
It's not allowed to be born. I heard it's not allowed to be born in a Jewish sanctuary.
I don't know why that would be.
It's
Yeah.
outrage and.
Yeah. I don't know whether it has to be. Maybe it shouldn't be. But if But we're getting into an area that I'm not confident enough to say for sure. Very interesting question, though. Yeah, good question, worth looking into. The Midrash Prt4 says, unlike the sources that we saw until now, which is the Gemara and Sanhedrin, the Zohar, this Prt4, another Midrash says that in fact the bodies will be resurrected in their prime. Will be resurrected in their prime. I saw one of the commentaries tries to reconcile the seeming difference between the first sources and this latter source as follows. That the first sources would say that the body will be resurrected first in its infirmities and then perfected, is going under the understanding that the loose bone remains intact, so that the body that emerges from that loose bone will have the quality of the original body when it died, and therefore be resurrected in its infirmities, and will therefore have to be miraculously brought back to its state of perfection. The latter understands that the loose bone can be destroyed. It's intermingled with the dew of resurrection, therefore to create a new body entirely, resurrected from anew, which is not essentially connected to the previous body through the physical remains of the loose bone, and therefore it's resurrected anew. So I don't know if we have a generally accepted opinion on this, other than the fact that the resurrected body is coming from the loose bone. So what we see so far is that it's coming from the loose bone. The loose bone seems to be in the spine, somewhere in the upper part of the spine, probably opposite to the knot of the tefillin. It creates a reformation of the body according to the opinion of Shammai from the inside out, and the body itself is first resurrected with its infirmities and then miraculously brought to the state of its perfection, like Adam and Eve at the time of creation, who were also, by the way, of course, created from the earth. So to the resurrected bodies, like Adam and Eve, will be coming out of the earth in the state of these of 20-year-olds. Some of the interesting details about actually the stages of resurrection are going to include the question like whether the bodies of the righteous, how will they be resurrected? What's the point here? According to Jewish sources, the bodies of the very righteous do not decompose underground. They remain intact. They remain intact. And this is one of the reasons, for example, that we find that Yaakov and Yosef embalmed, their bodies were embalmed in Egypt, even though that wasn't a Jewish procedure. One of the answers given as to why they did that is because, certainly in the case of Yaakov's having Yosef having his father Yaakov's body embalmed, is that he knew that his father was a tzaddik. And as such a great tzaddik, Yaakov's body would not decompose. And if his body didn't decompose, the Egyptians who were idolaters would come to deify Yaakov's remains. And therefore, he agreed to have his father's body embalmed so that people would attribute the preservation of Yaakov's body not to his being righteous, but to the fact that he was embalmed, and therefore prevent them from worshiping him. Yeah? And it's a similar reason why Yosef's body was hidden under the Nile until the Jewish people were redeemed, so that none of the Egyptians would see the preserved remains of Yosef and come to deify Yosef as well. And therefore, this is just one source which attributes the fact that the bodies of the righteous do not decompose. We're going to see some more sources about this shortly, but the basic idea is that since these people lived very spiritual lives, their bodies became infused with spirituality, and that protects so that the bodies actually became more soul than body. The intense presence of the soul in the body made their bodies more like souls than bodies. So that when they die, this body is not subject to the worm, to rot, to decay, decompose. It remains. So our question is going to be, that we're going to see more sources about that, but the ultimate question is going to be, what's going to happen to these spiritualized bodies of the righteous? Will they decompose in order to undergo resurrection, or will they be resurrected as they died and remained in the ground whole? Before we do that, question, comment.
When we went to the cave of Machpelah,
Yeah.
and we saw the tombs,
Yeah.
are the bodies actually in those tombs or beneath them, or are they actually in there?
I don't know if we know whether the bodies are actually there today or not. What's that?
Why doesn't anyone? I know it's
First of all,
a sacred place.
Well, yeah. If I'm just saying, first and foremost, the Arabs and the Muslims who basically rule there will never tolerate anybody going down. Number one. Number two, even according to Jewish tradition, a person is not allowed to go there, and there are stories of people doing so and dying. And therefore, it's been sealed off, and as far as I know, nobody has really entered that place. In recent times, somebody claims to have gone in there under the stealth of night with a crew of 2 or 3 people, and were roaming around the inner labyrinths of the Machpelah below, but even they, I don't think, claim to have seen any bodies. So, either those bodies decayed, or they haven't and they're there. But they've been sealed, and as far as I know, nobody has seen those bodies. The Gemara talks about somebody who went into the Maras Machpelah and saw there what seemed to be a light which was bright as the sun, and it turned out to be the heel of Adam Arishon. So at least in Gemara times, who went into the cave? Adam. They saw the heel of Adam because of the people that are buried there. You have Adam, Avram, Yitzhak, and Yaakov, and the head of Esav, right? Now, there is just some examples of the bodies of the righteous not composing. We find that the Torah in Dvarim, Deuteronomy chapter 34, says about Moshe that his eyes had not dimmed and his vigor had not diminished. Rashi explains there that this is referring to even after he died, his body did not decompose, as an example of how the righteous, whose bodies become spiritualized, do not decompose. There's another Gemara, a very interesting Gemara, Baba Basra, page 58, where there was a certain magician. It would seem to be he was a non-Jewish magician or wizard, and he was roaming around in the graveyard trying to strip the dead of their clothing. Now, he wasn't just trying to steal from the dead in order to get a wardrobe. Obviously, he was taking the clothing that was used to enshroud the dead in order to tap into the negative forces of death and impurity in order to practice his magic and witchcraft and his dark designs and things like this. So we're told in the Gemara that he found the burial cave of a certain rabbi there. This is Rabbi Tuvi bar Matno. And when he went to try and take the clothing off the rabbi that was buried there, the Gemara says that the rabbi that was buried there reached out and took hold of this wizard's beard, and he wouldn't let him go, implying that the rabbi was somehow not only intact but also alive under the ground, in his burial place. He took hold of this wizard's beard. So the wizard was crying for help. Another rabbi came by and spoke to the rabbi whose grave had been plundered and said, "Let him go." So the rabbi let him go, according to the Gemara, and the wizard left. Next year, the Gemara says, the wizard came back to the same place trying to get this clothing. What's the explanation there? It would seem that perhaps it was the Yortzeit or something. There was something special about this day, and he went specifically to this grave, despite the fact that the previous year his beard had been taken hold of. He realized there must have been some very special power to the body that was buried there. The proof is, he took hold of his beard. So he chanced to venture there another time, next year, and take the clothing again. And the same thing happened. The rabbi, the Gemara says, grabbed the person's beard. He called out for help. The same rabbi came by, again, probably indicating that the rabbi realized there was something particular about what this wizard or practice of black magic wanted to do, and he understood that it would probably happen again next year on the same day. So he made himself available the same day, next year, and this time he said, "Let him go," but he wouldn't let him go. He asked him again, "Let him go," but he wouldn't let him go, until the rabbi had to take a pair of scissors and cut off the wizard's beard. And in this way, he freed him. Obviously, the cutting off the beard was something considered to be very disrespectful. And there must be deeper messages here as well. It's kind of an interesting, far-out type of a story. But anyway, this conveys the idea that there's something which remains intact about the bodies of the righteous after they die. There's another similar Gemara in Shabbos 152, which describes how there were certain gardeners that were burying in the property of Rav Nachman. As they were digging in the earth, they heard some noise, rumbling from under the earth. So there, they were very perturbed, and they went in order to see what was going on, and they discussed what was happening with Rav Nachman. So Rav Nachman heard this, and he thought it was very strange. He went out into the yard in order to see what was going on there. And lo and behold, he actually saw that there was a body buried there. Who was this body? This was the body of Rav Achai Bar Yoshia. And he said to Rav Achai, right, what are you doing there? What are you doing under the ground? And he said, I'm buried here. So the rabbi quoted from a verse and says, it says that a person shall return to dust. And here I see your body's whole. So he says, you might know Chumash, but you don't know the rest of Torah very well, because it says elsewhere in the verse that jealousy decomposes the bones. A person who is subject to jealousy, his bones will decompose. But if he's not subject to jealousy, he's a person who has elevated his character traits above normal human behavior, that person is not going to be subject to death and decay. So he said, well, if that's the case, then why don't you just come out of the grave and join us? He said, you really don't know what you're talking about. Clearly, right, we learn from another verse that a person is to be deposited into the earth until the time of the redemption. At that time, he will come out of the grave. So, according to this, we find that the phenomenon of a person's being particularly righteous and pure can actually spare himself from death and decay. And therefore, based on all of this, the question is, what's going to happen to the righteous? The righteous who die are buried, the bodies remain intact. At the time of resurrection, will their bodies remain, will they emerge as they were intact underground, or will they undergo some type of decomposition and re-resurrection? The answer that's given is that they will in fact decompose. The question is why? If the body was whole enough, was pure enough, in order to make it free from decay and decompose, so then why at the time of resurrection is it not holy enough to be resurrected as it is? And the answer that's given is as follows, that it's true that the bodies of these righteous individuals were spiritualized through their holiness, but that's only vis-a-vis the world as we know it. They elevated themselves above the behavior of most of the people in the world. And therefore, when the world, as long as it is the world as we know it, these people will excel, and their bodies will be subject to the laws of decomposition, and they won't decay. But when you're talking about the period of resurrection, those bodies are going to be resurrected, yes, anew, into a new spiritual reality. And that spiritual reality is going to purify the world to extend far beyond the world that we know now. In order for those people to be resurrected and have eternal bodies in that state, their bodies have to be purified from any taint of sin. Even if they themselves overcame to a great extent their evil inclination in this world, but they still have a certain degree of the transgression of Adam and Eve in consuming the fruit of the tree of knowledge and good and evil, and it's that tainting of that original sin which has to be removed. So the body remains intact until resurrection. At the time of resurrection, the body is going to instantaneously decompose, and from that point on, it's going to be resurrected. That being said, what about the people who are alive at the actual time of resurrection? It's one thing when you're talking about people who've already died, and they're either decomposed and are going to be reconstructed, or they haven't decomposed and they'll need to be reconstructed. What about the people who are alive at the time when the world becomes perfected through resurrection? What's going to happen to them? So the Zohar in Parshas Mishpatim discusses this and says the following. The Zohar says, based on the verse, I cause death and bring life. The Zohar comments, until this moment, death was brought about via the other side, the Sitra Achra. From this time on, meaning from the time of resurrection forward, I will cause death and give life. Meaning, from the time of resurrection, all those who did not experience the taste of death and were still alive at the time of resurrection will experience death directly from God, not from the Sitra Achra. So their death is going to be a holy death, not caused by the Satan, by the Yetzer Hara, by the forces of impurity, by the Sitra Achra, but rather God is going to intervene and arbitrarily bring death, a positive type of death, on anybody who remains alive at the time of resurrection. And then they're going to rise immediately back to life. Why the Zohar asks, is it necessary that those living at the time should experience momentary death? The Zohar answers, in order that no impurity will remain in the world, and there will be a new world brought about through the workings of the Holy One, blessed be He. So that even the people who are alive at the time of resurrection will have to undergo an instantaneous death and an immediate resurrection, those who merit being resurrected, in order to join the community of the resurrected. Very interesting point. The last and final topic that we want to cover is the question about non-Jews. Where do non-Jews fit into all this? We know that the Torah has and prescribes a way for non-Jews in order to connect to God and to attain holiness. The Torah has 613 laws for the Jews and has 7 laws for non-Jews. These laws are applicable to the Gentiles, and a Gentile who lives his life according to these laws, whether he does what he's supposed to or refrains from transgressing what he's not supposed to do, is considered to be a righteous Gentile. And he even gets, according to the Gemara, a portion in the world to come. The question is, what world to come are we talking about? Are we talking about the world to come where the soul remains after death in heaven, but no more? Or would we say that the non-Jew would even merit the final stage, which is resurrection? In the merit of being a righteous Gentile, would a non-Jew therefore merit actually getting to world to come part 2, which is the world of resurrection, or not? So here we have an interesting source, and that is the Midrash in Prt4, chapter 13. Rav Chia bar Abba says that, and he's comparing rain to resurrection. He says that rain, a day of rain, is actually better than the day of resurrection. Why? He says, because he says rain benefits both animals and humans. Everybody derives benefit from rain, but resurrection, only humans. A day of rain is better than a day of resurrection. Why? Because a day of rain benefits Jews and non-Jews. But the day of resurrection benefits only the Jews. So from the Midrash here, it would seem that even though there is an idea of there being a righteous Gentile, one who observes the 7 Noahide laws, even if he attains the world to come, that would be applying to the world to come, meaning the soul world, heaven, where the soul would go after the person dies. But to go so far as to be resurrected, that no. That's what it would seem. However, one of the commentaries there in the Midrash, the Prt4, says that that's not the case. It's not excluding non-Jews from resurrection. Why then, he asks, does the text say a day of rain is better than a day of resurrection because resurrection applies only to Jews? What he means to say is it applies only to people who are living like Jews. Only people who are living like Jews. In those times, you had Jews who were observant of God's laws, and you had non-Jews that were idolaters. But if you have a scenario where non-Jews are living according to the dictates of God, they would become like Jews, right? Not they become Jewish, but the point is, they have a relationship with God, they are connecting with God, they are fulfilling the will of God, and they are refraining from transgressing God's will, so they become like Jews insofar as they are connected to God. Since they are fulfilling their purpose for creation, they are perfecting themselves, each person according to what he's supposed to. A Jew is a Jew, a non-Jew is a non-Jew. Then anybody who is Jewish, meaning anybody who's a Jew, anybody who is living his life by connecting to God, a Jew is a Jew and a non-Jew is a non-Jew, either one will be resurrected, right? By this token, what that means then is that when it says non-Jews will not be resurrected, it's not just referring specifically to non-Jews, it's referring to anybody who's living his life as a non-Jew, which would mean, that even Jews who are not living a life which connects them to God will not be resurrected. And that makes perfect sense. That's absolutely true. A person who, for example, a Jew, lives his life according to righteousness will merit resurrection. A person who's not, will not. And therefore, that seems to be the accepted opinion, that it's not so much a function of whether a person is Jewish or not, but the extent to which a person is connected to God or not. If a person is connected to God, whether he's Jewish or not, will merit resurrection. A person who's not connected to God, whether he's Jewish or not, right, will not. The Zohar also makes a similar teaching. The Zohar in Parshas Vayeshev implies that the idolatrous nations of the world will not be resurrected. And since he says the idolatrous nations of the world won't be resurrected, that implies the idolatrous members of the nations will not be resurrected. But the non-idolatrous, monotheistic, believing members of the nations will be. Certainly that's true regarding the Noahides. Whether that would apply for let's say, Christians or Muslims, insofar as their beliefs and practices overlap with those of the Noahide laws, they might merit or they might not. It's my understanding that they would not, but rather what will happen is that over time, the monotheistic religions of Islam, well, say Christianity and Islam, will be brought into line. They themselves will bring into line their beliefs and practices according to the teachings in the Torah for non-Jews as well. So that ultimately Christians and Muslims will become Noahides in the pure sense. Not just that they happen to follow the Noahide laws in the name of a particular prophet, let's say Jesus or Muhammad, but rather because they understand that that was conveyed by God through Moses to them directly. And therefore, they will bring their beliefs in line with the beliefs of Judaism. And that would fit in, that would be in accord with what the Rambam says, is that the rise of Christianity and Islam and their proliferation is part of the divine plan to wean humanity away from idolatry towards monotheism in order for them ultimately to prepare themselves and be willing to receive the teachings in the Torah for non-Jews. So that Christianity and Islam are just a transitionary phase, a passing phase, which will bring all of the non-Jews who are willing into the path of the Noahide laws. Another source for this, that non-Jews, righteous non-Jews, will be resurrected, is the Abarbanel in his work called Ma'aneh Yeshua. And he writes that the resurrection will apply to all of mankind, not only to Jews. And he brings two reasons for this. He says, number one, all of the dead will be resurrected. One, so that the righteous will receive the reward that's deserving of them, that they deserve. And two, so that those who don't deserve it will rise to see that they didn't. Because plenty of people say, who says God exists? Who says it matters to God whether you do X, Y, or Z? So at the time of resurrection, they're going to be resurrected as well to see it makes a difference, only they're going to be left out. As they excluded themselves, they'll be left out. But this implies, even if it's in a negative sense, that Jews and non-Jews will also be resurrected. Some will be in, and some will be out. Second reason is that the nations, the idolatrous nations, will realize the folly of their beliefs, and the result of that, there will be a great proclamation of the unity and glory of God's name. Because all of those idolatrous nations and all of those oppressors of the Jews will ultimately be resurrected in order to see that the despised and oppressed people are actually, in fact, the people of God, conveying the message of God to the rest of humanity for their benefit. Humanity chose to close their ears to that message of benefit and even went further to persecute and annihilate the Jewish people, so they will be resurrected to see the folly of their actions. So according to this then, resurrection will apply to Jews and non-Jews as long as a person was righteous and tried to connect to God. In the case of non-Jews, probably more specifically, if the person consciously led his life as a Noahide. This concludes our discussion on resurrection. B'ezrat Hashem, the ideas that we've discussed here in resurrection will provide a platform for going one level higher into this odyssey into the spiritual realm, where we'll be discussing in the next two parts the actual world to come. What's the world going to be like after resurrection? And that will be the continuation of the series tomorrow.